Okay, welcome to our fourth and final session on God and science. If you watched the last session, I ended it by making a very bold claim. I said that only the Christian worldview can make sense of science. And so in this session, we're going to unpack this a little. So let's dive right in. I want to just maybe take things back to the ideas we spoke about initially, the ideas that we first must accept to do science. And those ideas such as the reliability of our senses, our mind's ability to understand the world, and accepting that nature is uniform. And you see, these ideas only make sense when we assume the Christian position. These ideas are called, and here's your big phrase for the day, the preconditions of intelligence. And the reason they're called preconditions is because you must accept them before you attempt to examine whatever it is you're examining with your science. And if you think about it, in order for us to do science, we all take for granted that the universe is something that can be understood. Even though conditions are different throughout space and different periods of time, we all assume a logical, orderly universe. A universe that obeys laws and laws that remain the same over time. And it's only because of this regularity that scientists are able to do what scientists do, and that's predicting outcomes into the future. For example, we know in the field of astronomy that scientists are able to predict where certain planets are going to be many years into the future. And this is because of the uniformity of nature. By the way, just as a side note, it's important not to mix the idea of uniformity of nature with the belief of uniformitarianism. Uniformity in nature is concerned with the regularity in the laws of nature, which, as I said, remain the same over time, whereas uniformitarianism is a belief that conditions, not just laws, but conditions as well, remain the same over time. And this is a non-biblical and non-scientific position. It's a belief that's concerned about how the world operated in the past. And so this regularity that we all take for granted only makes sense when we assume the Christian worldview. And so let's think about this for a moment, and I'll try to illustrate the point I'm making. Suppose I should have brought a rock. Suppose I had a rock in my hand and I asked a question, what will happen if I let the rock go? We all know how we'd answer that question. It's simple. The rock will fall until it meets resistance in the form of the ground or something else, a table. Suppose I ask you another question though, like how do you know the rock will fall to the ground? You might say, well, that's an easy question to answer also. We know that it'll fall to the ground because every other time we've dropped rocks under normal circumstances in the past, the rocks have hit the ground. Gravity takes over. And so that answer will satisfy most people. But if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we kind of have to ask ourselves another question. If we're really going to get to the truth, another important question. And the question is this: how do we know that future rocks, the future rocks that we drop will behave like past dropped rocks? Bit of a tongue twister. Because, we're using the past dropped rocks as an assumption about the future dropped rocks. What's the connection between the two? Sure, we've observed and experienced that rocks fall in the past when we let them go. And we know, for certain that they've fallen because we've seen it happen. We've experienced the past and we've even documented these experiences. This is what we do in science, right? But we've never observed the future. Nobody has ever experienced tomorrow until, well, it becomes today. So we can't use the scientific method alone to justify what we know is going to happen when we drop the rock tomorrow. You see, we must provide an answer to this third question. How do we know that dropped rocks tomorrow will behave like dropped rocks today? We know they fall today, so how do we justify our belief that they will fall tomorrow? How do we bridge the gap between what we know today and our belief about what we expect tomorrow? It seems like we have a bit of a problem on our hands that needs to be resolved. And how does the Christian resolve this issue of dropped rocks and of science? The Bible tells us that God is all-knowing and that he is beyond time in 2 Peter 3:8. It tells us that he knows the future from the past. He is omnipresent, which means he's everywhere in Psalm 139. We know that, we have uniformity because it tells us in his word that he upholds all things by the power of his word in Hebrews 1:3. It also tells us that God is consistent and that he cannot lie. So we can trust what he says in Titus 1:2 and 1 Samuel 15. So because of all these credentials that only God possesses, he is the only one who is in a position to tell us that the future will be like the past, because he already knows what the future will be like. He is in a position to tell us that we're going to have seasons in the future as long as the earth remains, as he has done so in Genesis 8 and 22. And so the Christian has every reason to expect that rocks which drop today will also drop tomorrow when we let them go. In other words, the Christian can expect uniformity in nature, which makes science possible. But if you don't start with God, you don't have a logical foundation, on which to base your belief that tomorrow's science will be the same as today's science. And so all your scientific inquiries are based on an unprovable assumption that you can't justify. I know this is a different way of thinking because we don't normally, stop and think about the things that we're thinking about. But you've got to. On purpose, you've got to make yourself think about the reasons behind your beliefs. Most people, think they're rational beings, that the beliefs they possess are, all there because of good reasons. But people are impacted by other factors, psychological factors, emotions, a lot more than they realize. And it's only when you stop to question these beliefs that this becomes clear. So how does the non-believer, the unbeliever, the non-Christian deal with this challenge, this issue? For example, if an unbeliever was to hear this argument that they can't make sense of the uniformity of nature without science, what are they going to do? How are they going to respond? One thing for sure, they're not going to let go of their position very easily. You're going to have to probably engage in a little bit of rational combat if you want to convince them. And so what type of responses might you expect to hear to this argument? One regular response that I often hear goes something like this: well, we know the future will be like the past because it has always been like that in the past. And so is this response valid? Not at all. It's not valid because this person is simply assuming the very thing they're being asked to prove without offering any reason for it. They're simply saying that the future will be like the past because it was like this in the past. But I want to know how they know and can justify their belief that tomorrow will be like today. As the famous atheist philosopher David Hume pointed out, he said, when you offer the past as an answer to know how the future will be like the past, you're begging the question. And in logic, this is simply not prohibited. You can't hold on to logic while being illogical at the same time. It doesn't make sense. It means the conclusion to the argument is the same as the initial premise. It would be like saying God exists because he exists. Deal with it. Giving up, argument A for the justification for argument A. And it just doesn't make sense. Another response I often hear, unbelievers will argue that, well, we can't know it for certain that the future will be like the past, but we can know with a high degree of probability. A friend of mine said this to me the other day. But probability is based on past experiences too. We know conditions have been like this in the past, you see, so we're 99% sure that it's going to be like this in the future. And so these people are still assuming the very thing they're being asked, that the future will be like the past, and they're still guilty of begging the question. Another frequent argument people will offer, they'll say something like, will you stop it? Matter simply behaves in a regular fashion and that's that. And as matter is part of the universe behaves in a uniform manner. And of course, this answer fails for many reasons as well. But for instance, how do we know that matter tomorrow will behave like matter today? How do we know that it'll be uniform? And besides, how many things in the universe are constantly changing? Lots of them. So why wouldn't we expect the laws and uniformity to change also? Another popular response that non-biblical thinkers will offer is something like, well, we can't really explain, why uniformity is the way it is, but we know it works. This is the pragmatic approach. But at this point, when someone says we can't really explain, they've just told you that their belief is without a justification. So their own position stands refuted and your job is done. And even if they can't see this, they're still begging the question. Because how do they know that uniformity will work well into the future? Granted, it worked well in the past, but what about tomorrow? Some people will take another approach and respond by saying that science does not have any presuppositions. They'll argue that the facts speak for themselves. I hear this all the time, and perhaps you've heard it too. It's kind of presumptuous though, right? So my view is the right view. Now let's be done with this. If only things were that simple in life. And if you think about those TV crime programs we spoke about, they'd be over in the first minute of the show. You know, the attorney would stand up and say, Your Honour, there's no need for any arguments from both sides here because the facts speak for themselves. This is just not how reality works. Facts don't speak, folks. People do. And if facts did speak, we certainly, wouldn't need to hire expensive attorneys to argue a case, because the facts will just speak for themselves. And so no argument is needed. And so when you say facts speak for themselves, by the way, you're guilty of committing another fallacy in reasoning called the fallacy of reification. This occurs when someone, gives life to an abstraction. And so one last objection, and then I'll quit, is the objection, and this pops up the whole time, and it goes something like this. I don't need God to do science. I don't even believe in God, and I'm a scientist, right? And I get along just fine. And this crops up the whole time. And the person who argues in this way, I suppose they've kind of missed the point of the argument. Because we're not arguing that you must profess a belief in the biblical God to do science. It should be clear to most people that you don't have to accept reality for reality to be or exist. People have many different beliefs, some crazy ones, which don't happen to be true. But that doesn't mean that reality ceases to exist. Reality is reality. And so this argument, that we're making is not that you must believe in God to do science. Science will work either way. The argument is that in order for science to be possible, God must be real, regardless of whether you believe it or not. So if you don't believe in God, you can still do your science. You're just being inconsistent because you're denying the very thing that makes your science possible in the first place. And then you're carrying on with your science. Okay, so you can see I need to wrap this up. The non-Christian thinker can't make sense of the uniformity of nature. And therefore they can't rely upon the successes of science without relying upon the Christian position. They certainly can't use science to disprove God's existence. It would be like a person who wants to argue that they don't need air to breathe. It's a silly argument, right? But because in order for them to make the argument against the existence of air, they'd have to breathe in air. They would have to rely on air to carry the vibration of their words so their argument could be heard. The critic of air relies on air to argue their position against air. Therefore, the critic of air must be wrong. And in like manner, the scientifically minded critic of God needs God to have science. The moment they attempt to use science to argue against God, they've already lost. And this problem, by the way, just in case you're interested in philosophy, is known as the problem of induction. And non-biblical thinkers throughout the centuries, believe it or not, have been working very hard to come up with ways to get around this issue. And it's like a constant thorn in their side. But it's a problem which can only be resolved when you surrender to the Christian position. This is not just a matter of one belief over the next. This is a matter of the truth. It's a matter of intellectual honesty. Can the non-Christian position make sense of the world around us, including the successes of science? I say they can't. As a Christian, though, we can be confident that our worldview is the correct view of reality. It's not arrogance, it's just an acknowledgement of reality. We can be absolutely certain that God is real and that Jesus Christ is his Son and our Saviour. Thanks so much for listening, and hopefully see you again soon.